Thank you so much to our audience who's joined today. Thank you also to our very accomplished panelists who have joined us for this very critical discussion on climate communications, and a discussion that is not always had in India, is my sense. A bit about me. I am Avantika Srivastav. I am journalist by training, and right now I lead strategic communications for climate growth in India. I'm building out their entire strategic communications portfolio, including programmatic communications on the work that climate growth is doing in India, such as decarbonization of steel, working with the state governments, working on renewable energy procurement, working on the switch to electric vehicles, and much more. And in the future, we are hoping that we are going to concretize spaces such as these where we can have discussions on climate communications, where we can actually bring in perspectives such as today of different communicators, different kind of communicators, including journalists, including communicators from the policy think tank space, capacity building organizations, as well as philanthropists. And that's also a good overview of actually the kind of discussion and the kind of panel that we brought to you today. To introduce our panelists, we have Gaurav Saini, who is an environment and climate journalist at India's largest news agency, Press Trust of India. He has extensively reported on climate and environment. Some of his stories have also gone on to inform court decisions and actually make its way into the legal canons. Then we have Mihir Shah, a strategic communications and brand management expert with over 14 years of experience in public policy. He is currently the Director of Strategic Communications at policy think tank CEW. We also have Sally Rane, who leads the strategy for ecosystem messaging at Rain Matter Foundation. She's trying to identify the most effective way to talk about climate change in India. And Kaushik Yanamandram, who is the lead green accelerator at Climate Asia. He spent well over 15 years on climate action and on organization building and capacity development. So, thank you so much for joining in, panelists. I hope this is going to be a very fruitful conversation for all those who have joined, as well as for us as communications practitioners. We have limited time with us today. We have about 55 minutes to an hour of discussion, and then we will also launch in question and answers. Some house rules for the audience who is right now present with us. There is a Q&A box, a question and answer box that you will see at the bottom of this of the Zoom window. And please put in your questions. Please also do identify who is it that that question is for, so that the relevant speaker can take up that question. We'll have around about 15 minutes for question and answers. So I hope that that is, while that might not rather be enough for all the insightful things that we are going to discuss today, but will be a conversation starter. And as I said, this is not the end of it. We are going to concretize something for the future as well and have these conversations much more regularly. So yes, diving straight in, my first question would be for Gaurav. Gaurav, you have extensively reported on climate, sustainability. You have been to various COPs. You were recently at COP29 as well. But you know, the basic fundamental um thought that comes to any layperson's mind, and even our mind when we started out, was why is there a need to talk about climate in the first place? And usually, what are the kind of story angles that you look at, and why do you choose to look at those story angles and not others?
Okay, thank you, Avantika. Thanks. Thank you for having me here. Very, very pertinent and very timely discussion. So whenever we encounter any problem, it is always important to communicate about it because you cannot fight anything or you cannot address anything until and unless you communicate about it. Similarly, you cannot fight climate change and adapt to the rapidly warming world if you do not know what's happening, right? So, and this is why it is important, and it is more important in India because I'll give a few data points, and you'll be able to understand the situation in India and the extent of the climate crisis in India. According to periodic labor force survey, we have around the latest census data is not available, but we have periodic labor force survey which says 373 million people in India live in poverty, and which is much more than the entire population of the US. And nearly 58% of India's population depends on agriculture for livelihood, with more than 80% of the farmers are classified as marginal farmers, which means they have land holdings measuring less than 2 hectares. And the research from CU, Council for Energy, Environment, Water, we have here, and IP Global reveals that 75 to 80% of Indian districts are highly vulnerable to extreme weather events. So these data points suggest that India is very, very vulnerable to climate change. There is a large number of people in India directly affected by climate change. So it makes more important to communicate more about climate change. It is essential to communicate to tackle this critical issue. So, as about you asked me what kind of stories I do. Uh, in human-centric stories, I generally highlight the impact on communities and their health and livelihood, and then talk about solutions and what's working and what's not, and what is needed. In hard stories, uh, such as those related to international negotiation, I try to bring in climate justice perspective, knowing very well that the poor communities from developing world did not contribute to climate change, and they are the ones who are bearing the worst impacts. I'll stop here.
Right, Gaurav. And just an add-on question is that even now, and correct me if I'm wrong, and definitely I would want the panelists also to come in here. Um, we are seeing that this trend that in the mainstream media, human-centered slash community voices are there, but they're not center and front and center rather. They're very much muted. The conversation on what those kind of communities, what our kind of communities, they're going through, and a lot of the reportage is still very much on reports, conferences, summits, very detached from the lived experiences of people. So, what is
Mhm.
going on in newsrooms in your experience, and what can be done about that?
Right, right. So people often complain that climate reporting is centered around negotiations and all the climate plans, summits on climate change policies, etc. Uh, they believe journalists should focus more on discussing uh, climate change through lived experiences, as you said, and personal stories, which is true. But I believe people should be able to connect or relate to stories to their lives. And why would they be interested in a bunch of people wearing suits and throwing legal jargon at each other at hundreds and thousands of kilometers away? That said, reporting on climate plans, conferences, and government policies is equally important. Uh, this is why I said this is because we have to ensure that these policies and conferences do not leave out the interest of communities most vulnerable to climate change. Right? For example, it is important to report on the government's plan to meet renewable energy target by constructing more hydroelectric projects in the Himalayas, which are already reeling under the burden of uh, unchecked construction and tourism. So what I'm saying is that these reports, these plans and conferences are pieces of the puzzle, and you cannot complete the puzzle with just a few pieces, right? These policies and plans play a major role when it comes to mitigating climate change impacts. That said, they are meaningless if the people for whom these policies and plans are being framed, they do not know anything about them. So I feel both are important, and good pieces are those good article and stories are those that combine the two, both policies and human touch. One example I would like to give is we did one story before the last year's climate conference began in the UAE. It was about loss and damage. I and Arasu from the Associated Press reported it for AP. And the intro itself starts with one poor man who has lost his house to flash floods in Himachal Pradesh last year, and it goes on to convey the extent of death and destruction India experienced due to the highly erratic monsoon last year. So the story combines human emotions and technical negotiations related to losses and damage from climate change. Coming back to the question, one of the major reasons for the lack of climate stories based on people experiences is that such stories require significant travel, time, and of course funding. And these are luxuries that many newsrooms cannot afford. Only few environment and climate focused news portals such as Down to Earth, Mongabay, and India Span and Scroll, the print, to some extent, The Wire, they have been doing such in-depth human-centric stories, but in limited numbers. And this is only possible because they are not required to provide information to their audience. Their mandate is quite different. They're not required to provide timely information on other things to their audience about government decisions or developments, like news portals like PTI or AP does. So that's a major, I think that's a major challenge. Limited space in newspapers is another major challenge. We often see that there is no space for long form human centric stories in them. However, there is no such limitations on websites which have ample space available. So, yes.
That's a very pertinent point, and I think at Climate Group also you're sort of thinking about these things, and that's where I would want to bring Mihir as well, because as non-profits, one part of what we are trying to do now, the non-profits that are working on climate, is how do you reach the public? Is this the job of only journalists, or should communicators who are part of nonprofits also be doing this? And I think, Mihir, a question for you here, because I know that CEW's Tom's practices have evolved beyond the traditional policy think tank space where you're just publishing reports that then go to perhaps the government or other key leaders in the civil society space. You're actually going out and doing things like Faces of Climate Resilience, which was a documentary then that was showcased on Hotstar. Why is your team thinking of all of these terms, tactics, and products? Why is it important at this juncture? Should the focus not be actually on evidence building and augmenting that rather than this?
Thanks, Avantika, and thanks to Kaushik as well to kind of creating the space for this discussion. To kind of answer your question, the first thing I'll say is, I've been with CW for close to 11 years now. I joined CW in 2014. We were a way smaller organization then, 14, 15 people. And I was not coming from the sustainability space. I had a grounding in communications, but sustainability was new to me. In the early years when I entered a think tank, which I never heard or understood a think tank before I joined CW. At that point of time when I entered, I realized that the focus was primarily on research communications. When we tried pitching some of our initial studies or the studies that came out during my initial years, there wasn't as much space in the media. There was not as much interest. If you, in my view, in mid 2010s, climate change was still an environmentalist issue alone. It was like, oh, here are a bunch of people who care about the planet. So they've got things to say and, they think this is really important, but not many cared. I would say since then, and since I've had the opportunity to see the evolution, I would say uh, climate change as an issue itself has it's come forward by leaps and bounds. It's, especially I would say in the last 4 or 5 years, at least couple of shifts that I would like to point out to. One is, this youth movement that has come through, not just Greta Thunberg, but I think there have been younger folks across various countries who've been championing climate change and, talking more boldly about it. And second, I think the one very big shift is this net zero announcements that have come all over the world. And, I think with that net zero announcement is a realization in government offices, in industries, that the world is going to change. And that the world has agreed to change. That's left everyone, with questions that, either you start preparing for the change and moving with the change and kind of, move forward to grab those kind of business opportunities, or you get stuck in the past, or you get, you lay behind. So I've seen climate change as an issue evolve quite a bit. And I think, it's just going to go up and up, right? At least for the next 20, 30 years, or for most of our careers, I see it as the issue of our times. It's not a simple issue. In terms of, why should a not-for-profit or why should CW think about communicating for climate? I think we've had an evolution there as well. When I started off, when we were a younger institution, the focus was on, research communication, policy communications. We were very clear, we are a not-for-profit research organization. Our biggest strength is doing independent research, and then ensuring that, the research is disseminated to key influencers like, Gaurav, like policy makers, industry folks, etc. The reason why CW has been doing things a bit differently in the last 4 5 years is actually it's not a communication team led shift. It's an institutional shift. It's an institutional shift which we kind of took in 2020, where we, at a leadership level, the realization was that we wanted to impact sustainable development at scale. At an institutional level, we realized that, CW was founded in 2010. We realized that, in the first 7 to 8 years, we were having considerable impact on, informing policies, helping new policies come in, improve current policies. But we realized that, by just telling people what needs to be done and showing them the evidence, the needle wasn't moving. And, the pace of change that was desired wasn't happening. And so at an institutional level, a realization was that, we'll have to roll up the sleeves and get working with these actors, right? As much as one may say, every actor has their unique set of challenges. And that's where, the decision was to roll up the sleeves. And in the last 4 or 5 years, CW has deeply increased its state level presence, right? Being engaged with state governments. At the same time, we aligned that, we aligned on the goal that we want to impact sustainable development at scale. And to achieve that, we realized that, just working with influencers wouldn't be enough. We have to start connecting with the larger masses. And it was a decision that came at the leadership level, which then gave us the room to start exploring. That's the reason I would say for climate communications in India, as I understand our space at the moment, it is important that the need for climate communications is appreciated at the leadership level. And, I think every organization is at different stages of evolution. Every organization comes with its own strengths. At CW, we've been lucky that, our CEO has always had has been a strong communicator with a clear appreciation of communications. And so, even in the earlier years when I was at CW, I felt the research team didn't appreciate communications as much. We were just we were another part of the admin function, right? In their view. But I think we were a bit lucky that the CEO had a vision for communications. And I think for climate communications to grow, especially in civil society organizations that are not comms first, that vision needs to come at that senior leadership level. It is only then that, the communications team will have, the space to try out and do different things. And again, you mentioned that, why you guys moving, not looking at evidence. So evidence building and finding evidence is still a big part of what CW does. It's that we are institutionally very, very clear, and, the message is very clear to the communications team as well, that, that remains, that's what we are known for. That's the soul of the organization. But what it also helps us is that, we found ourselves in a slightly unique spot. And I think, even say folks at your end would find yourself in a unique spot where we are close to us to the science and can have the opportunity to tell stories in an engaging way, right? The opportunity to understand the science well enough, because in my view, uh, climate change is not a easy topic, right? It's a very complex topic. It's a very layered topic. And our experiences of working on various products has been that, climate change means different things to different people. There could be folks who would feel that, you know, working on air quality is working on climate change, where, and while of course, everything is interconnected, there are differences out there. And so we realize that, we are in a unique spot where, as we craft our climate communications, we can constantly go back to our in-house expertise and, bring them, for most of the communications, or I would say for all the communication products we are creating, we have the privilege of going to our experts and making them a part of the process as well. Yeah, and I think, to answer, perhaps to kind of expand a bit on the question you asked Gaurav as well on, why is climate communications important now? I'd like to say that, this 2024 is likely to be the year when we breach 1.5 degrees, right? And for those who have followed the climate discourse, 1.5 degrees has been that, we've had 2 degrees and we've had 1.5 degrees. It does appear that experts say that 2020, by the time we finish December, they're going to say that, okay, this is the first year of a 1.5 degree world. And there is enough literature to suggest that, for folks who are, say, perhaps joining in their 20s, and assuming that you're going to, with the development, you're going to have a slightly higher, you're going to live for more years. For the next 60 years, these could be one of the coldest years of your life, right? The warmest year of, and imagine that to be when you're in 2050, 2060, to feel that these were the coldest years that you have to feel. So it's very clear that it's a problem that is just going to increase. It is also a problem, like, if there's been research that, what are the issues that India cares for today, right? Some, I think, research that had come out in a couple of years, and I remember things like unemployment, inflation, fuel prices, cost of living. And what climate change is going to do is going to make all of these worse. And hence, it's important that people start understanding climate, not just in a unidimensional way, but in its various facets, in ways that they can see and observe in their immediate surroundings, so that it doesn't appear theory. So I think we are definitely going to see climate change communications rise over the next 20-30 years. It's more like, when I kind of try and process what I do for a living, and I try to make sense of this, I feel that, climate change is like the pandemic we experienced, but it's just happening in a slightly elongated time scale. And if you remember, when the virus first came out and it was reported in China, folks in India, US felt कि यार वो तो कुछ China का virus है, it's never going to turn up, right? And bit by bit, so what happened over a few months, and which we felt very strongly about, this is likely to play out over the next 20-30 decades, which will hit different people at different times in different regions. So for someone, climate change might be, if you're in Spain and you've seen floods that you've never imagined, you're going to feel that this is a moment for now. And, someone may, for the next 10 years, they might feel very sheltered. You might have the privilege or the luck of being sheltered, but in 2035, you're going to feel strongly for it. So I think it's important that, as people start experiencing, there is a basic awareness level that goes around. I'll pause here. Thank
Yeah,
you.
no, there are two very important points for me, Mihir, that you spoke of. And one of those points is the fact that what really is climate communications? Is it about lived experiences? Is it about evidence? Is it about research? Is it about something else? Or is it Actually, and this is where I think towards the start of my career, I used to ponder on these questions as to what are we doing as communicators? It doesn't seem like a function or a job skill that makes changes in people's lives. But then I understood it does, because it does seed ideas and it does seed knowledge, and it's basically seeding those very critical things that then germinate into action. And that's where I would bring Sally towards your second point, Mihir. Sally, you are working on messaging, on really looking at within the ecosystem, how should we talk about climate, and what does impactful climate communication look like? What are your learnings on that? And considering the fact that we just heard Gaurav, we just heard Mihir on their perspectives, but from the philanthropy sector, from the perspective of the philanthropy sector, why is it important to engage with climate communications, on climate communications with climate change at this juncture?
Yeah. Hey, thanks, Avantika. Very happy to be here. Um, so I think a good question. So why do we care about why does Rainmatter Foundation care about messaging? I think it's a little bit it's similar to what Mihir was saying about communication is not an addendum. So it's about like how CW, it's about an institutional shift they made and about what they think they're trying to solve a larger problem and thinking about what it will take to solve that larger problem. So I think on similar lines, at the foundation. So at the foundation, we say that hey, we're looking to solve this very large abstract problem of what you could call the climate crisis, right? And you can call it many names, but broadly, what we're all talking about, the poly crisis or the climate crisis. And when we think about that, we do think that so this is going to need a lot of shifts, and it is going to need a lot of us at different levels. So as individuals, as organizations, as governments, to make a lot of these shifts. We do think that a lot of now some of these shifts are very fundamental, and they also will only come from changes in behavior, so to say. So changes in behavior for individuals, changes in the way we operate for organizations. And they also come from some very deep rooted beliefs that will also need to shift, right? So, like, for example, we'll mostly not talk about it in terms of shifts that need to happen, but we really need to think about changing the way we think about consumption, right? And some of those things come from some very deep rooted beliefs we have about maybe growth or how we think about what's important in life and where we need to go. And so we basically we at some point came to the conclusion that hey, for all of this, messaging is a very important tool. Because if I don't get people to maybe change the way they think or change the way they behave, change the way they operate, then I can have a lot of technology and I can have a lot of solutions and I can have all of that, but we're probably still not going to be able to, really solve the problem that we're all here to do, right? And that's kind of, sorry. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt there, but just as a follow-up question, because we would have among the audience here, perhaps, when you talk about messaging, let's break it down. What is it that you're talking? Just that.
So when I say messaging, and we spoke about a few of the stakeholders, so it is actually to all, as in to broadly, we put it into three categories of stakeholders, and within that you can break it down. But it is messaging to individuals, it is messaging to industry or corporations, and it is messaging to government. Now, messaging to government is broadly what is policy advocacy, and there's a bunch of specialized organizations that do that. Okay, by the way, Rainmatter by itself doesn't do we don't do this directly, right? We're not operators on ground, but we will support organizations that are doing this. So messaging to governments understood as policy advocacy, and it's probably a space where you at least have a few organizations, doing, and over at least for the last few years, at least a decade or so, the specialized organizations, like CW is of course one of them. Messaging to individuals, messaging to corporations, you don't really have as much, because you don't really have any as much activism in India, and a lot of other Western countries you see a bunch of it. Again, not to say that the same model should apply in India, but just saying that there's some gap there, right? And in messaging to individuals, that's probably a part where, of course, like journalism comes in, and there is, what you could call the mainstream media, mainstream journalism. But today there's a lot more, right? There's the entire digital media. There is social media, and for what it's worth, there's a lot happening even there, right? So there's a lot of channels for you to use. And so therefore, when we say messaging, we think about all of this, right? And again, like you were saying, it's because today, in some ways, the channels of reaching out to people have gotten distributed, right? And you could have influencers, you could have an individual who decides to be an influencer and do it. You can have every organization talk about what they do, and you have the channels to do that. So in some ways, you don't have as many gatekeepers anymore, right? Also because people are choosing to like see and listen and hear to whatever they want. And so when we think about messaging, we think about all of this. And in some ways, it's become more difficult, but in some ways, it's also helpful, right? Because you spoke about human-centered stories. One of the elements that we also think about is about the local and regional context, right? Which also comes in language. Now, what is the language in which you're able to reach out to people? And one of the big gaps that we have seen, that still, even now, a lot of the climate communication is happening in English, or to some extent in Hindi, right? But even that's very little. Most of it happens in English. So very little happens in regional languages, right? And so if you have to do that, then maybe you use a lot of other methods of, and other channels of communication. So when we talk about messaging, we talk about all of this. To me, messaging has to do the purpose of bringing information to people in a way that is simple enough for them to understand, number one, right? Because that's another big problem with a lot of climate. There's so much jargon, people have no idea what you're talking about. So one, it has to be simple enough for you to understand. Two, it has to engage people, which means it has to be contextual. It has to talk to people where they are, right? And Mihir was alluding to this in part of what he said, but it affects different people in different ways. And so you need to go to people where they are, right? It is going to affect us in ways we can't even imagine. It is going to affect what we eat. It's going to affect where we live. It's going to affect where you can travel. It's going to affect what you wear. It's just going to affect parts of our life we've not even imagined right now. And it's about going to people in maybe all of those ways. And then so to me, messaging has to kind of do all of this. And as long as it's taking the information to people in a way that can probably nudge them to, make choices or act in ways that, helps the bigger problem, all of that is messaging. Yeah, I'll kind of pause, but does that answer your question?
It does. And that also brings me a thought, because the kind of work that Climate Group has done over the last 20 years, and we've been in India for 16 years now. And especially from the communications lens, that is something that I can share, which is one part of this equation is reaching out to the public at large and generating awareness, making sure that climate change is a talked about issue. Another part, and this is something that I often hear, is what are businesses doing? What is the government doing? And I think there's a disconnect between the public and the business and the government side on exactly what is happening. And what Climate Group sort of is trying to do, and sometimes also succeeding at, is looking at, well, can you actually communicate to businesses, to these large corporates that have the heft and means to act on sustainability, to act on, for instance, can they procure renewable electricity? They have the heft and means to do that, but maybe sometimes it is also a mindset problem. And that's why communications also comes in, which you raised a very important point on, Sally, on the fact that you have all of these players across the board. There is an entire sort of universe of people who we have to influence, we have to talk to. Mihir spoke about the intersectionality, the layers of it, of the fact that every single thing at this point and in the future will be affected by climate change. It's going to be a deep undercurrent. Kaushik, you have not spoken as yet, and I really want to bring you here. You worked extensively on organization development. You worked with grassroots level NGOs. You've been to the field. Where do you think the disconnect is? And I'll bring us back to the first question on, are we hearing enough voices of local communities? Is that the case? To me, maybe we are not. We are not sort of also hearing them in mainstream media, as Gaurav said, because of certain things, including uh, his words were luxuries such as funding reporters to go to the field, etc. But equally, there's this question of NGO capacity, non-profit capacity that Mihir and I were discussing, that the fact that there are not enough communicators who can do this kind of communication at the ground level and bring it up. What is your experience?
Yeah, no, thanks, Avantika. It was great to hear all the other speakers from their experience. And I think as a capacity building organization, or we call ourselves ecosystem enabler, the the aspect of communication becomes important for us to understand from the perspective of the grassroots communities, and the grassroots organizations, both. These are two different levels, or not levels, probably two different stakeholders. To give an example, some of the grassroots institutions that we worked with from Jharkhand and Odisha, most of them came up with this challenge around communications, that one thing is about talking the language of climate with the funders, with the research institutions, and with various other stakeholders for us to mobilize resources. And there's another thing about communicating about climate with the community, and also understanding how the community talks about climate change. They don't necessarily use the word climate change, not only in terms of the change in language. It's also, what we need to understand is, climate change is a word probably coined by some academicians and researchers at some point in time, and it became a mainstream word now, at least in a section of the society. But what does it mean if we don't directly truly translate it? But what does it mean? How does it manifest? How do people talk about it at the grassroots? How does a farmer talk about climate change? What is climate change for them? Uh, how does a rural household experience climate change? And what is their lived experience? And what are the channels for them to tell their stories? I think those are the challenges with which the grassroots institutions came to us. Now, when we naively thought that, okay, let us do a capacity building module on communications, but that didn't serve the purpose. We had to iterate and we had to improve our own modules and capacity, because because understanding climate change is also about stories. You can't expect a community and a group of farmers to understand what 1.5 degrees is, and pre-industrial levels are, and host of different phenomenon that is happening. While it is important to help them understand, you also have to communicate it in such a way that they understand it in their own stories and stuff. So that became important for us to acknowledge and recognize. And then we also felt that there's a lot more to learn from the community than to sort of think that we will teach them what climate change is, or we will introduce them what scientists have created evidence about, and all of that. So there's a lot of evidence from their lived experiences also that exist at the grassroots level, the effect of climate change. So how do we also sometimes capture those stories and their experiences? I think that became very important for the grassroots institutions. While there is a totally different kind of communications and capabilities that grassroots institutions talk about, which is about like, how do I write a great proposal to put my case before a funder? How do I build an evidence for a problem that I'm seeing in my community? How do I frame that problem statement and build enough evidence and probably quote some research and authentic sources to establish my case? So that's another different kind of a capability that organizations are also looking at. I think these two different things are something that we see as climate communications when it comes to capacity building. And like Saili said, language plays a major role. In many cases, even for creating proposals and building evidences from the grassroots organizations do it so well in their regional language. If you ask a local NGO from Odisha and ask them to narrate a story of how climate change is manifesting, they would beautifully explain it in Odia. But if you expect them to sort of narrate that in English, and of course it will lose its spirit, and lot of things are lost in translation. And then all that organizations do is pick up jargon and sort of like just throw it on the proposal, and that also sort of creates a disconnect in the communication. So I think we are seeing a lot of these gaps, and we are trying to see how we can plug these gaps. I think one of the things that we are trying to do is not really preaching or teaching anything, but just create a space where they are able to communicate their stories to researchers, and the researchers and the scientists or anyone who's interested to support the communities can communicate with them and understand. I think that space for dialogue or multiple conversations is what we realized is important. Uh, I think that acknowledgement of that nuances that exist when we talk about communication has become very important for us in the last couple of years, and we are still learning. We are now going to start working in 4 states in the northern part of India, and I'm quite excited to see how climate change is communicated in mountains, how it is communicated in the plains of Indo-Gangetic plains, because every ecosystem, terrestrial ecosystem, or every geography also has various different stories of how climate change is experienced and also spoken about. We have clearly seen beautiful stories around, the belief system around Jal Jangal Jameen, and the stories around how important it is. And many NGOs still call that jungle hamari maika hai, like for communities. They see it that way. It's not like, but for us who study about climate change from reports and science, we see forests as a source of carbon sequestration or biomass or something else, revenue and commodity and this and that. But we need to understand how communities look at forests, how communities look at river systems. And I think those differences in how the worldview is for different communities, and how we need to play the role of bridging that understanding has been paramount for us in the past many months. I'll pause here. I think this is how we look at communications right now.
Yeah, no, most definitely, Kaushik, beautifully put. And the portion in your comment about creating spaces for dialogue, I think is something which is not only a need but also a solution. That also brings me to the next part of this conversation. We've laid out the challenges and the obstacles, the things that are not happening, but there might be things that are also happening, the best practices. So, in the interest of time, I would request the panelists to sort of give quick fire comments. And I will start with Sel here, just sort of extending what Kaushik said. There is a need to create spaces for dialogue. And philanthropists, funders, that entire ecosystem can possibly encourage the nurturance of such a space, of such spaces. So, what do you think philanthropists can do to support climate communicators, Sally? And is there a challenge that philanthropists themselves are facing right now on this topic?
I I don't know there's a challenge. I think that see there's definitely I think a growing a lot of philanthropists or funders understand the need for messaging or communication, and so there is definitely a growing acknowledgement of the fact that something needs to happen here. I think one way in which we have thought about creating those spaces is basically trying to foster an ecosystem that can bring these together and kind of one is help each other, also kind of create some tools or infrastructure which can be shared, right? And also maybe try and create some public goods that then can be used by the ecosystem at large. So, for example, one of the things that we hear very often is you don't really so it's in the realm of data, but you don't really have a very good India specific, maybe a climate survey. So there are some that have happened and there's some global ones that have come in, but not really something that's, at scale is also contextual to India. Like, one, like what Kaushik said is very relevant, right? Like, what does climate change mean? If you go and ask people, like, in a rural area in India, they all understand it, but they're not going to use the word climate change, right? So, of course, if you go and ask people, is climate changing? You're going to get an answer, which is probably yes, but do they understand the nuance? So that's, for example, one of the things. But I was just giving an example of what a public good could mean. So one of the ways in which we've thought about it is about supporting that ecosystem, not just at an individual, project level, but can you create some of those, maybe public goods, infrastructure, capacity building, which then, can give a leverage points for organizations. And then every organization, of course, can build its own communication muscle, right? And so one of the things we thought about is creating some kind of a hub. So we call it a climate narrative hub where organizations can come together and kind of benefit from each other. What these shared narratives could be, because we also feel there is merit in creating some shared narratives versus siloed efforts, which kind of happen quite often now, right? So for example, even if you were to pick up a theme, so maybe let's pick up like human wildlife interaction is a theme. There's a lot of organizations working on it. A lot of them are even trying to talk about it, but the efforts are very siloed. So can we just bring them together? So that's one way in which we think philanthropists can create a larger leverage versus just individual organizations that you can support. That's also super important. But can you do that? So also can you do maybe some more capacity building? So for example, even like talking about journalists, right? So the point Gaurav is making is so there's just not enough funding for environmental journalism, right? As in you are not organizations are not able to support people spending a lot of time going deep and doing stories. And that's also led to the fact that there's not enough apprenticeship then, and younger journalists don't get to learn, how to do this. So maybe some part of it is saying, hey, can you do some fellowships, right? So can you want to do like climate journalism fellowships, which at least gives young people an opportunity to learn this, right? Because otherwise you're cutting people off right at the beginning. So I think those are some of the things which we think could be higher leverage, ways for philanthropists or funders to come in.
Point well taken, Sally. And that is also, I think, a good seg to Mihir, considering the fact that Sally also spoke about organizations and how philanthropists can build ecosystems. But each organization has its own value, its own vision, its own mission, and its own purpose of being in the system, in the world, so to speak. So, Mihir, as a policy think tank, let's come to the core or the DNA of your work. As a policy think tank, what you're communicating is primarily, and correct me if I'm wrong, is to shape policy in some way or the other. But policy change is complex. Policies themselves are complex. How are you addressing that issue through communications? One bit is working with programs, technical programs. Those programs can be on steel, they can be on transportation. But just in terms of communications, where do you see the role of communications in policy?
Role of communications and policy. In terms of how can communications play a role in improving policies? That's the question. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it, even a policymaker, average policymaker today is extremely busy, is extremely kind of, is overloaded with content, right? We are all in a world where content is just growing year on year. And I think, in terms of improving, using communications to, reach out to policymakers, I think one needs to get a bit creative with the formats at times as well. uh, you know, uh, Gone are the days when you would prepare a really well-designed report and expect that a policymaker is able to read it, right? And will go through it cover to cover, right? Increasingly, of course, what is very bread and butter for our space is creating these workshops, seminars, conferences where they come to get and engage. But I think, if one has to go further ahead on the curve, one of the things, I'll give you an example. We have this program called Powering Livelihoods, under which we've been supporting these small enterprises that are creating clean tech solutions, such as imagine a solar refrigerator or solar dryer, etc. And we are supporting these enterprises to grow up their businesses. So we are supporting 15 such enterprises at the moment, 15 to 20. And in terms of how do you get word of this exciting work that's happening on the ground, how do you get it to policymakers? What we did last year is, in addition to the usual bread and butter conference that one would do, where you'll have panel discussions, etc. We actually got some of these technologies out there. We set up an experiential space out there where we were lucky enough to get Minister R.K. Singh coming in, and he spent around 30 minutes just meeting these people who were using these applications, right? And hence the reach out to policymakers needs to be varied. You need, and again, often, when we have younger folks joining the team, and especially when they think they're joining a research heavy organization like CW, most of them say, we want to simplify the science, we want to talk to the larger audiences. And I think while that is important, I think climate communications or the larger issue will benefit if everyone can pick up narrower target groups and create communications that are purpose fit, right? So again, for us to realize that, I think 55% of the population in the country reaches Hindi, but most of our experts publish in TOI, Indian Express, Mint, etc., right? And just to, if you want to speak to an MP, an MLA who is from the Hindi speaking belt, you're not going to reach out to them via publishing in Indian Express, etc., right? You have to be where they are. So I think, the practices need to change at times. Like right now we are in the process of rolling out a campaign on scaling rooftop solar with the government of Uttarakhand. And in each of those cases, again, to get the policy maker excited, at times it requires making jingles. It requires making catchy campaigns. You have to think, if you have to engage the policy maker, you have to think what are that person's incentives, right? I think for us to expand the issue as such, and especially when we say that, how do we bring, I think most people, at least say the people on this call, a good chunk of our participants, most of them are fairly committed to the issue. They understand the issue. They understand the nuances. They want to fight for it. But we are here to figure how do we bring more into the fold. And there, I think the conversation, the climate conversation needn't be about the climate. And the conversation needs to be linked to other things. While of course I think climate awareness of climate change needs to be there for everyone, but we have to talk about electric vehicles. We have to talk about how rooftop solar. We are not going to Uttarakhand and telling people that rooftop solar lagane se आप इतना carbon emissions बचाओगे. We are telling them आपकी electricity bills इतनी कम होंगी, and we are telling them कि there's a really good government subsidy going on right now, so the costs are reduced for you as well, right? We have to talk about some of these issues around, like if you're talking about if you're trying to nudge diesel auto drivers in Amritsar and trying to get them to use electric autos, you have to talk to them about, how much more money can they make. You have to talk to them about, how much less servicing perhaps it might require, etc. So I think we have to learn to, it's very difficult to convince people that, climate change is the most important thing in life. I think we'll struggle if we go down that route, and you'll in all likelihood you'll be seen as, very strong on ideology, and that kinds of comes in the way of behavior change. But I think if you can talk about the different things that people can embrace, adopt, and then of course, as a separate strategy, work with influencers to make, especially for the young, make things cooler. I think, a lot of people uh, kind of then look up to people, look up to idols. We are a country where we are used to looking up to people as influencers as well. I'll pause here, Avantika.
No, thank you, Amir, because there were some very pertinent strands, especially on, and this is a running theme in this conversation. You have to communicate where people are, not just speaking what you want to tell them, but really what is beneficial also for them. Before I move on to Gaurav, and then we launch into the questions, Kaushik, just quickly, if you could share something on institutional building from that perspective, what are the next steps? What can be done to consolidate climate communications in institutions that need them?
I think because our focus is on the grassroots institutions and, like civil society, NGOs, and farmer producer organizations. So I would talk from the perspective of how do we build capacity for them. I mean, like I said, we are doing various different experiments and also improving on how we can offer space for them to learn. But I think I really want to uh, like I'm really aligned with what Sally was saying about like creating those public goods, right? Like at a larger level, because what we are doing is also when it comes to at the scale at which we are doing, it's not at all sufficient, not at all. The pace is so slow, and we need it faster. We need it wider. So we need to find ways to sort of pick up learnings from various experiments happening across the country. Many different organizations are already doing various different amazing things with various different communities. And how do we pick all of those best practices and put it into a playbook that can be, scaled? And I feel like that's the need. Some initiative around that and support for that would be great. Many institutions like us would come around that and play our own role in sharing our knowledge and what we are learning, and we can also learn from 100 other institutions in such spaces.
Indeed, and I think Sally is noting something down. So let's hope. Gaurav, moving to you. You represent the journalist community, at least on this call, and as I spoke with you earlier as well when we were discussing the webinar, what you're doing is something of immense important value. What what can help you overcome the challenges that you outlined? And some challenges might be long term, some might be short term, but just generally, broadly, in some quick terms, what is it that can be done to support journalists in India on climate? Sorry, Gaurav, you're on mute.
Am I audible now?
Yes.
So challenges are aplenty, but to start with, as I have said, uh, honestly, what I perceive, what I've seen over the years, working on the ground and listening to people and seeing many reporters working on climate change, is that many newsrooms in India still do not take climate seriously, and this is uh, basically because India as a country has many other issues to deal with, especially larger issues, especially poverty and access to good healthcare, education, employment. So basically, though climate is worsening every other thing, be it healthcare, be it education, but it falls down the ladder. So uh, I can say with a certain degree of confidence that many large newsrooms do not discuss climate change in their daily meetings even. So many do not have dedicated beat reporters. Climate change and environment are considered as additional beats and not primary beats. So, and one of the participants to this webinar, one of the participant asked this question that loss and damage is not being covered by agencies, even as it is happening in Delhi. It is precisely because uh, news agencies in India do not have resources, uh, kind of resources that agencies like Associated Press or Reuters or Bloomberg would have. They have climate teams with 10 members and 20 members in news agencies like ANI or I'm fortunate that we have 2 or 3 climate reporters to cover this environment and climate policy and other things. But like INS, they have one single reporter. So, and climate and environment itself is a big field, right? You have air pollution, you have industrial pollution, you have water pollution, you have land pollution, you have wildlife, and you have many other things to report on every single day. So it comes to priority, what you want to report today, whether you want to do an in-depth piece on loss and damage, or whether you want to just report the big news in the climate and environment landscape today. So there are limiting factors. As I said, that we do not, many newsrooms do not have resources, and they do not have time, they do not have funding, and reporters, it is said that reporters should be scientifically educated while covering such beats, and they do not have training. Again, it comes to resources. Newsrooms do not have resources to train their reporters, right? So there are training programs, and think tanks and other civil society organizations are conducting fellowships and trainings, but there is need to have more such programs. I think Shelley touched upon that, Mihir touched upon that. We need more such programs to early or mid-career fellowships are there by EJN, by Stanley Center for Peace and Security, by Clean Energy Wire, but we need more such basic training programs for journalists coming into the field so that they have this nuance understanding of what is climate change and how can they start with, right? How can they start reporting on climate without going very deep into it?
Indeed,
I'll pause.
No, thank you, Gaurav, for that response. And I see that you also sort of answered one question on loss and damage for the benefit of our audience as well. The question was, loss and damage is seen in urban settlements too, where news agencies have a presence. So why is it not receiving coverage in that setting? And Gaurav has already responded to that. Um, it's a good segue to actually now take some questions in the time that we have. And the questions are open to panelists unless and until somebody has specifically asked a question to a specific panelist. I will take this question about what are your thoughts on corporate reports like annual reports, sustainability reports, where ESG disclosures are being discussed? What efforts are being done by nonprofits to make companies accountable on these communications on climate strategies? So I can take that question considering the fact that we extensively work with businesses, and in our understanding and in our work, what we have seen also is, for instance, standardization and regulatory mechanisms really do help. For instance, we have an initiative called RE100, where companies, large corporates, are committing to procuring 100% renewable electricity, but they cannot be part of that initiative unless and until they are thoroughly vetted. And I think that kind of standardization, that kind of regulation, that kind of sort of accountability, so to speak, is necessarily needed. You can't sort of tell the communications person as to why this was printed, a communications person of a particular corporation or a particular company in that respect on why that was printed, because usually in most organizations, communications comes down the line. It comes towards the end. Rather than being a complementary partner to programs, it's something that is an afterthought. But I'll pause here. Is there any panelists who would like to respond to this question? Not really. All right. So, well, you have one perspective then. The other is, and this is again open to all panelists, what role does misinformation play in shaping public perception on climate issues? And how can it be countered? This is a very valid and valuable question. Sally, maybe you'd like to take this one?
Yeah. So of course, misinformation is honestly it's a big problem. Also because sometimes it's misinformation, sometimes it is, and the misinformation can be deliberate or or it could be accidental. So there's also a lot of greenwashing, right? Which comes from corporates, but there's also a lot of greenwashing, and then things can just get picked up and spread, right? And especially in the world of today, in the world of distributed media and social media, like you can't really control much of like what's then going to go viral. I can give an example. So misinformation it can be very disruptive. I'll give an example. So just a couple of months back, there was a lot of coverage on of wolf attacks in UP in a district called Barij, right? And then it was a huge story, and there was a lot of coverage of basically of it being already covered as a wolf attack, and the wolf being termed as a man-eater, or it was in Hindi, it was an Adamkhor bhedia, right? And it creates a lot of panic, and then actually creates a lot of like adverse reactions from people, and it worsens the conflict. And then there were also a lot, and then there were some nuanced reports that basically said that, hey, we don't actually have enough evidence to even say whether it is a wolf attack or not, because they've not been DNA tests, and a lot of experts actually said this is not wolf behavior. All that. The only point I'm trying to make is there's sometimes, now this could probably just be very little information, which maybe whoever covering it had, but it got picked up, and then it's become viral. Sometimes it is also greenwashing, right? Which is very deliberately, trying to put things in a way which, is misrepresentative of what's actually happening. That's a problem. I think in terms of how can you counter it, now it goes back to, again, we've seen all the challenges with journalism, but some of it then goes back to, plain old journalism saying that, hey, can you put the right information out there, right? I also think the other way is you have a lot of organizations working on grounds. It could be CSOs or any organization working in the field. Everybody has some kind of media presence today, right? Everybody has a social media presence. So one thing is to actively actually make an effort to try and counter it when you see such things coming up, because honestly, the only hope you have of countering it is if you have enough voices, right? Because you don't have a fact checker. There is no environmental fact checker that exists today. I'd be very happy if somebody decided to do that. But in the absence of that, it's going to take people from the community to at least put that voice out there. So if you see something that's wrong, and okay, instead of discussing it with your colleague next to you, also figure out if your org can put that out there. And probably that's the only thing I can think of.
Indeed. And I noticed Kaushik is also typing his answer. So we could perhaps move on to the next question. Mihir, I think this question speaks to what you mentioned in one of your comments. how can we make the climate communication not alarmist and actually grab the attention of readers? Because alarmist communication often deters viewers to actually read the content. Basically, what you were saying about
Yeah.
message where people are.
Yeah, no, I think it's extremely, extremely important. I think there is growing scientific evidence to suggest that alarmist messaging on climate change is not working. It's actually people are disengaging from it. So, I think I think it's important increasingly to be aware of solutions. It's important to be aware of a range of actors who are using solutions, some best practices, some pilots that are emerging. And it's important that all kind of climate communications, while it doesn't have to bypass the issue, it needs to be in a format where, you talk about the issue, but you also talk about what the solution is, right? There's unless we as a society or the communities do not know what to do, it's pretty much like that, an asteroid hitting the earth and you'll be like, what can I do, right? You're pretty much in limbo. So it's extremely, extremely important that, as climate communicators at various CSOs, etc., of course, one should put the facts, right? Because if you're not able to articulate the problem very clearly, then people may not see the reason to act. But it's extremely important that once you've articulated the issue, you're able to talk about solutions and you're able to, again, in the Indian context, it's never really helpful if your solutions are coming from Europe and America, etc. People typically you listen to it and they'll be like, this doesn't work in India. So it's important that you're able to see that, do localized solutions exist either in your city, either in your state, or in another state of the country. I think that is what gives people hope. It gives people a sense that, change is possible. And it's also a reason where, increasingly you have these state rankings on various things, which suggest that, some states on a certain issue are doing well, and that learnings for the other states lie in, understanding, can I pick something from what XYZ is doing?
Just want to add one thing, right? And just building a little bit on what Mee said. You have to give people solutions, and the framing I like to use is, so you can't give people only the problem and leave them with a sense of despair. You have to give them a sense of agency, right? So the reason solutions are important, and because the solutions have to also come with context, which is why the whole local thing is also important, right? So you need to give people a sense of agency. They have to, as in they have to feel at the end of it, yes, it's a problem, but there's something I can do, which is actually, can get me out of there, right? You can't leave them at a place which tells them that, hey, hopeless, the world is going to end, right? So while some of that, see, I also think some of the alarmist thing is needed, okay, sometimes, because it's a problem and we need a sense of urgency, right? We can't take 100 years to solve it. We don't have 100 years, okay? So some sense of urgency is needed, because and that's also important, because we can't have pledges which say I will do something in 2070, okay? Like, let's be real. But at the same time, the solutions give them a sense of agency, and that so that people feel a little empowered. You need to make people feel that you can actually do something about it. And so I think that point of having solutions and them being localized is very important, because only then will people feel that, hey, I have a way out, and be driven to action versus being driven to despair.
Driven to action versus driven to despair. That I think beautifully sums up this conversation. I'm going to take one last question because we are out of time, and that question is for Gaurav. Gaurav, somebody is asking, Nivedita is asking, how can one balance academic disagreement and nuance while covering climate? Usually, the space to write in newspapers is very limited. So how do you decide which side to showcase? So basically, this ties back to the angle. How do you decide on angles? The question that I asked in the beginning.
Sorry, can you just repeat the question, please?
Yes. So in a gist, how are you deciding on how to balance academic disagreement and showcase nuance, given that you have very tight timelines as well as very, well, maybe small space uh, to publish your stories?
Okay, yeah, it's a major challenge that journalists often encounter to balance disagreements. But when covering climate change, one thing is pretty clear that when it comes to disagreement in terms of whether it is happening due to climate change or not, there are a lot of attribution studies now available. So you cite those attribution studies as a basis to link a particular event to climate change. And generally speaking, we know that when it comes to climate change, when we know there is a pattern in heavy rainfall events, there is a pattern in temperature variation. If we are able to establish that, it is because of climate change, and we need just supporting quotes from various scientists. And if there are disagreements, they should be given space too. So. Generally speaking, there is a tendency among now these days that people attribute everything to climate change, but it is not the case. You have to be very careful while reporting about such stories. And one recent example was when Wayanad tragedy happened. It was not just because of climate change, right? It was there were many underlying reasons, be it quarrying, be it unchecked construction in tourism. So I think uh, balancing perspective is very important while addressing such issues. I'll stop there.
And that is also the school of journalism, I think, us journalists were trained in initially, at least. Thank you so much to the panel once again. I know I've said thank you twice or thrice now. It could be annoying, but still, this was a very sweeping whistle stop tour, but very insightful conversation. Given the number of questions we also had, I am sort of confident that the audience also were engaging with what all of you had to say. And I would equally thank the audience that has stayed with us for this 1.5 hours almost now. It is not often that we get together to discuss climate communications, and hopefully this will not be the end of it. We will have such conversations in the future also, such dialogues in the future also. Before we close, a big shout out to Climate Asia and my colleagues at Climate Growth, including Kashish, who is at the controls today, who has ably managed Zoom and who's made sure that our conversation has been seamless. With that, see you next time.